Imagine waking up to find that the money in your bank account can buy absolutely everything, except the one thing you actually need to survive the winter. That was Europe in 2022. The media told you it was a gas crisis caused by a sudden war, but the truth is much darker. The gas shortage was just the final domino in a game of economic suicide that lasted 3 decades. For 30 years, European leaders played a dangerous game of financial alchemy. They shut down domestic coal mines, closed perfectly functioning nuclear plants, and taxed heavy industry into oblivion. All the while, they patted themselves on the back for their booming service economies. They genuinely believed they had transcended the dirty physical world of manufacturing. They were wrong. This is the untold story of how an entire continent forgot that civilization is built on physical jewels, not printed euros. The numbers looked extraordinary. Through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, Europe's carbon emissions were falling. Factories were becoming cleaner. The industrial economy was, by every official metric, becoming greener. European policymakers pointed to these statistics at international climate forums with unmistakable pride. They had cracked the code that eluded every other major industrial power. They had not cracked the code. They had moved the accounting. What Europe actually did during this period was systematically relocate its most energy-intensive production to China, India and Southeast Asia, and then import the finished products back across 2 oceans. The carbon dioxide generated by smelting the aluminium, refining the chemicals, and firing the ceramics now appeared in someone else's national ledger. Europe got the goods and none of the emissions. On paper, this was an environmental triumph. In physical reality, it was the methodical dismantling of the industrial foundation that had made Europe the wealthiest region on Earth. What made this profoundly self-deceptive was the supply chain dependency it quietly constructed. Every factory that moved to Guangdong or Gujarat was a physical capability that could not be recalled overnight. Every domestic supplier that shuttered as a consequence represented a skill base, a logistics network, a technical workforce that does not regenerate in a generation. The clean balance sheet was real. The industrial vulnerability accumulating beneath it was equally real and entirely invisible to the people making the decisions. Europe had outsourced its industrial survival to geopolitical relationships it did not control, in exchange for emissions statistics it could display at conferences. The price of that trade would not arrive until 2022. But the invoice had been accumulating since 1995. There is a precise moment when European economic policy made a categorical error that no amount of subsequent technocratic refinement could correct. It occurred somewhere in the early 2000s, when the dominant intellectual framework shifted from asking, "What can Europe physically produce?" to asking, "What can Europe financially engineer?" The distinction sounds abstract. Its consequences were entirely concrete. The theory was coherent enough on its own terms. Europe would specialize in high-value services, financial products, regulatory frameworks, and intellectual property. The dirty, energy-intensive work of actually manufacturing things would migrate to economies with cheaper labor and looser environmental standards. Europe would capture the margin without bearing the cost. It would become, in the favoured phrase of that era, a knowledge economy. What this framework systematically ignored was the physical substrate underneath every financial transaction. A derivatives contract on aluminium futures requires that someone somewhere is actually producing aluminium. A services economy built on the consumption of manufactured goods requires that those goods exist in physical space, be transported through physical supply chains, and be powered by physical energy. You cannot print a megawatt. You cannot issue a bond denominated in natural gas molecules. When the physical inputs become unavailable or unaffordable, the financial superstructure built on top of them does not simply adjust, it collapses. European policymakers had convinced themselves that monetary policy and fiscal stimulus could substitute for physical industrial capacity in a crisis. The winter of 2022 ran that experiment to its conclusion. The answer was unambiguous, brutal, and entirely predictable to anyone who had not confused the price of a commodity with the commodity itself. The physical world had not read the policy papers. What happened to European heavy industry was not a market failure. It was not the consequence of foreign competition outperforming domestic producers on quality or innovation. It was a regulatory and fiscal framework deliberately designed to make certain forms of industrial production financially unviable within European borders. The industry did not collapse. It was systematically pressured to leave. The European Union's emissions trading system, introduced in 2005, placed a cost on carbon that fell disproportionately on the most energy-intensive sectors. Steel, cement, chemicals, and glass were not incidental to European industrial output. They were its physical foundation. The ETS did not make these industries cleaner. It made them progressively less competitive against producers in jurisdictions with no equivalent carbon price, which is to say against virtually every producer outside Europe. The result was not green innovation. It was carbon leakage, the relocation of emissions-intensive production to countries where the same activities faced no regulatory penalty. Simultaneously, the German energy vendor and equivalent national programs across the continent introduced renewable energy surcharges that were passed directly to industrial consumers. By 2020, German industrial electricity prices were among the highest in the developed world. A steel producer in Ohio, or a chemical plant in Louisiana, was paying less than half the energy cost of its German equivalent for baseload power. This was not a marginal competitive disadvantage. It was an existential one. The companies responded rationally. Investment migrated, plants idled, workforces dispersed. The knowledge accumulated over a century of European industrial leadership began its quiet, irreversible transfer to other continents. The policy had worked exactly as the physics said it would. The conventional explanation for Europe's catastrophic exposure to Russian gas in 2022 is that energy security was sacrificed at the altar of cheaper imports. This explanation is true but insufficient. The dependency was not accidental. It was actively chosen, repeatedly defended against internal critics, and expanded even as the strategic risks became impossible to ignore. Nord Stream 1 became operational in 2011. Nord Stream 2, which would have doubled the capacity of direct gas transit from Russia to Germany, was completed in 2021 despite years of objections from Central and Eastern European member states, United States government, and energy security analysts who had been publishing warnings about single supplier dependency since the Russian-Ukrainian gas disputes of 2006 and 2009. The German political establishment overrode these objections on the grounds that commercial interdependence would create strategic stability. The academic term for this theory is liberal institutionalism. The physical reality it produced was a German industrial machine whose survival depended on the goodwill of a single geopolitical rival that shared no fundamental strategic interests with its customers. By 2021, natural gas accounted for approximately a quarter of Europe's primary energy consumption. Russia supplied roughly 40% of that gas. In Germany, the dependency was higher. In some Central European states, it approached 90% for gas specifically. These were not the numbers of a continent managing risk. They were the numbers of a continent that had quietly decided the risk did not exist. The decision to trust an adversary with the physical energy inputs of your industrial base is not a policy error. It is a strategic abdication. Europe had made it with full information and had called it foreign policy sophistication. If you have made it this far, you already understand that this story is not about energy policy. It is about the gap between what a civilization believes about itself and what the physics underneath it will eventually confirm. That gap is the subject of every investigation on this channel. Subscribe if that kind of analysis is what you came here for. The rest of this story is where it gets structurally uncomfortable. The argument for transitioning European heavy industry to renewable energy is not wrong in principle. Wind and solar are genuine energy sources. They generate real electrons that power real equipment. The argument is wrong in practice for one reason, and that reason is not technological. It is mathematical. The problem with intermittent generation is embedded in the word. It is not always there. A steel blast furnace operates at approximately 1,600 degrees Celsius. It cannot be switched off when the wind drops and switched back on when it picks up. The metallurgical process inside it is continuous and temperature sensitive. Interrupting it does not pause the production run, it ruins it. The same is true for a chlor-alkali plant producing industrial chlorine, for a float glass line producing architectural glass, and for an electric arc furnace recycling steel scrap. These processes require what grid engineers call baseload power, reliable, uninterruptible, predictable electricity available 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Wind power in Germany generates at its rated capacity approximately 22% of the time on an annual average. Solar generates at capacity for fewer hours still, and produces nothing between sunset and sunrise. Advocates of the energy transition argue that storage technology and grid interconnection solve this problem. Neither claim survives contact with the actual numbers. Battery storage at the scale required to buffer the demand of a major industrial economy does not exist. and cannot be built within any realistic time frame at any realistic cost. Grid interconnection merely distributes the intermittency problem across a wider geography. The steel mill does not care about the annual capacity factor, it cares about the megawatts available at midnight in January. There is a counterintuitive truth at the centre of modern grid physics that almost no political communication about the energy transition has ever honestly addressed. Adding more generation capacity to an electrical grid does not automatically make the grid more reliable. Adding intermittent generation capacity to a grid that cannot store or replace it can make the grid dramatically less stable. Europe built this paradox into its infrastructure over 2 decades and called it progress. The reason is frequency stability. A functioning AC power grid requires that supply and demand remain in precise balance at all times, measured in fractions of a second. Historically, this balance was maintained by the rotating mass of large synchronous generators, the physical inertia of turbines spinning at grid frequency, which naturally resisted sudden changes in load or generation. When a generator tripped offline, the kinetic energy stored in all the other spinning turbines across the network bought the grid operators the seconds they needed to bring replacement capacity online. Wind turbines and solar inverters provide no such inertia. They are connected to the grid through power electronics that produce electricity at the correct frequency synthetically. When the generation suddenly drops because a weather front kills wind output across northern Europe simultaneously, there is no physical flywheel buffer absorbing the imbalance. The grid frequency begins to fall. If it falls far enough fast enough, automatic protective systems begin disconnecting generators to prevent equipment damage, which accelerates the frequency collapse in a cascade that can black out a continent. This is not a theoretical risk. It is the documented mechanism behind several near misses in the European grid between 2018 and 2021. Europe had built a renewable energy system on top of a physical infrastructure that was becoming progressively less equipped to support it. The announcement came in October 2022. BASF, the largest chemical company in the world, a company whose headquarters in Ludwigshafen on the Rhine represents the single largest chemical production complex on Earth, informed its shareholders that it was permanently restructuring its European operations, not pausing, not reviewing, permanently restructuring. Tens of billions of euros in capital investment that would otherwise have been deployed in Germany would instead flow to China and the United States, specifically to facilities in Louisiana, where cheap, reliable natural gas from American shale production made European energy costs look like a deliberate act of industrial self-sabotage. BASF was not unique, it was visible. Across the same period, Volkswagen announced it was reconsidering new battery gigafactory investments in Germany. ThyssenKrupp began restructuring its steel operations. Chemical producers Lanxess and Covestro cut European capacity. The common thread was identical in every case. Energy costs in Europe had reached a level where capital-intensive industrial production could not generate returns that competed with equivalent investments elsewhere. What made this capital flight structurally dangerous was its permanence. A factory that moves does not come back. The engineering teams disperse, the supplier networks dissolve, the institutional knowledge transfers to the new location and embeds itself there. When energy prices eventually normalise, there is no industrial capacity left to restart. The buildings are empty, the workers have retrained, the supply chains have reorganised around new geographies. Europe was not experiencing a temporary competitive disadvantage. It was undergoing an irreversible structural transformation that would take a generation to fully measure. The capital did not announce its departure. It simply stopped arriving. The economists who were surprised by the inflation surge of 2021 and 2022 were surprised because they were looking at monetary aggregates and demand-side models. They were not looking at the energy content of the physical economy. Every manufactured product, from a kilogram of bread to a pharmaceutical tablet to a car door panel, carries within its price the energy cost of every stage in its production. When the underlying energy price doubles, then triples, then reaches 10 times its historical average, the inflationary signal moves through the entire supply chain with a lag measured in weeks, not years. Fertilizer prices, which are essentially natural gas prices in a different chemical form, rose by over 200% between 2020 and 2022. European farmers faced input costs that made large portions of their operations financially unviable at any achievable market price for the crops they produced. Food prices across the continent followed with the predictable delay of one growing season. The European Central Bank, which had spent the previous decade trying to generate 2% inflation with aggressive monetary stimulus, found itself presiding over double-digit price growth in energy and food and claiming that the appropriate response was interest rate increases. The rate increases addressed the demand-side component of inflation by suppressing consumer spending and raising mortgage costs. They did not address the supply-side component, which was a structural energy deficit that no monetary instrument could resolve. The consequence was a middle class simultaneously facing higher prices for everything they consumed, higher costs to service their housing debt, and an industrial labour market beginning to shed workers as factories reduced output or closed entirely. The energy crisis had become a standard of living crisis. The two were, and had always been, the same phenomenon measured from different angles. The reckoning, when it arrives, does not come with an announcement. It comes as a series of policy reversals that each carries the implicit admission that the previous 30 years of energy strategy contained at least one fundamental error. Finland brought its first new nuclear reactor online in 2023 after a 14-year construction process. France reversed its nuclear phase out and committed to building 14 new reactors. Belgium extended the operational life of its Doel and Tihanga nuclear plants after years of scheduled closure. Germany, alone among major European economies, held to its nuclear exit and simultaneously reopened coal plants it had been retiring. These policy reversals are not the awakening. They are the first involuntary acknowledgement of physical reality by political systems that had convinced themselves that physical reality was negotiable. The awakening itself is slower, more painful, and involves recognizing that the transition back to industrial viability cannot be accomplished in an electoral cycle or a 5-year commission plan. Nuclear baseload takes a decade to build. Domestic mineral extraction requires years of permitting before a single ton of ore surfaces. A chemical industry workforce once dispersed requires a generation to reconstitute. The physical capabilities that were quietly dismantled over 30 years cannot be rebuilt by the same policy frameworks that dismantled them. They require capital allocation decisions made at the level of sovereign industrial strategy, sustained across multiple governments, in direct confrontation with the financial logic that drove offshoring in the first place. Europe is not at the beginning of that process. It is at the beginning of the debate about whether to begin that process. The factories that closed in 2022 are still empty. The capital that is left is still invested elsewhere. The physics has not changed its terms. Wealth cannot be printed. Industrialization cannot be regulated back into existence. The hard assets that underwrite a high standard of living must be owned, extracted, refined, and defended. Every civilization that forgot this has eventually been reminded. Europe is being reminded now.